Story 1. The Keeper of Boothil. The desert night was quiet. Stars littered the sky, casting a faint glow over the worn graves and crooked tombstones of Boothil graveyard in Tombstone, Arizona. The town, famous for its Wild West past, had become a tourist attraction, yet few dared to linger near the cemetery after dark. Known for its eerie legends and violent history, the graveyard housed the bodies of outlaws, miners, and gunslingers, men who had lived fast and died brutally. But the people of Tombstone knew there was one man who stayed long after the last tourist departed. His name was Jebediah Hawk, the caretaker of Boothil, a man as much a part of the cemetery as the stones and bones themselves. Rumor had it that he had been there for decades, though he never seemed to age. Locals whispered about his piercing eyes that seemed to bore into your soul and his uncanny knowledge of the dead that rested there. One October night, a group of college students from Tucson decided to explore the graveyard. They'd heard stories about Jebediah, about how he knew secrets that no living man should know. They didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but they were drawn to the stories, and the adrenaline rush of sneaking into a cemetery at midnight was too good to pass up. There were 5 of them: Sarah, Jack, Carlos, Emily, and Mike. Armed with flashlights, they made their way through the darkness, clambering over the low wrought iron fence that encircled Boothil. The cemetery stretched out before them, a maze of rough, weathered stones under a canopy of stars. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of dry earth and decay. As they moved deeper into the graveyard, Sarah spotted a figure in the distance, a tall man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and an old, dusty coat. His back was turned, his head slightly bowed, as if he were listening to something beneath the ground. "Is that him?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who else would it be?" Jack replied with a nervous chuckle. "Looks like our friend Jebediah." Ignoring their churning stomachs, they moved closer, trying to stay silent. They didn't want to alert him, not yet. They just wanted to watch him, to see if he did anything unusual. As they neared, however, he suddenly stiffened, straightening up as if he sensed their presence. Slowly, he turned to face them. His eyes, sharp and blue, shone even in the darkness. His skin was weathered like old leather, and there was an unsettling stillness about him, as though he'd stepped out of a different time, a different place. For a long moment, he simply stared, and the students froze under his gaze. "Come to see the dead, have you?" he said in a low, raspy voice. The group exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. Finally, Jack, ever the brave one, spoke up. "Just curious about the stories, you know. People say this place is haunted." A slow smile spread across Jebediah's face, though there was no warmth in it. "Oh, it's haunted, all right," he murmured. "But the dead here don't mind visitors. They're more restless when they're forgotten." "You're not here to forget them, are you?" "No," Sarah stammered, feeling a chill run down her spine. "Just wanted to see." Jebediah's eyes narrowed, and he motioned for them to follow. "Then let me show you something." He led them down a narrow path lined with graves, each one marked with a crude headstone or a cross. He stopped at a small, unassuming grave, marked only by a slab of stone bearing the name, Billy Clanton. "This here is Billy," Jebediah said, his voice soft, almost reverent. "A gunfighter. He died in the OK Corral shootout. Folks say his spirit still wanders here, seeking revenge for his untimely death." The students stared, half expecting something to happen. But the night remained silent, the only sounds the occasional hoot of an owl and the distant rustling of desert plants. Jebediah continued, his gaze fixed on the grave. "They say if you listen closely, you can hear him whispering. Go on, give it a try." Reluctantly, Jack crouched beside the grave and leaned in, straining to hear. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. But then, faint and distant, he thought he heard something, a whisper, too quiet to make out. His blood ran cold. "I heard something," he whispered, pulling back quickly. Jebediah's smile widened. "That's Billy for you. Always looking for a fight, even after all these years." He turned to the others. "Wanna hear another one?" The students nodded, though fear was beginning to gnaw at them. Something about Jebediah's presence was unsettling, as though he carried the weight of the graveyard within him. He led them to another grave, this one marked with a simple cross and the name Lester Moore. Now, Lester was a postal worker, Jebediah said, his voice low. Shot over a simple dispute. But he left his mark, even in death. As he spoke, a faint breeze picked up, carrying with it the scent of desert sage. The students felt a strange prickling sensation, as though they were being watched. "You know, the dead here don't rest easy," Jebediah said, almost to himself. "They're tied to this place, to their violent ends. Sometimes, they reach out, searching for someone to tell their story, to set them free." The students glanced at each other, the thrill of the night turning into something darker. Sarah, feeling a sudden burst of courage, asked, "Why are you here, Jebediah?" He turned to her, his eyes gleaming. "I'm here to watch over them," he said softly. "To make sure they don't wander too far. But sometimes, the dead aren't the only ones who get trapped here." The words sent a shiver through the group. Just as they were about to ask what he meant, they noticed a strange glow emanating from one of the graves. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger, casting an eerie light over the surrounding stones. "That's enough for tonight," Jebediah said abruptly, his voice tense. "You should leave. Now." The students didn't argue. They turned and hurried back toward the entrance, their hearts pounding. But as they reached the gate, Sarah glanced back one last time, only to find that Jebediah had vanished, along with the strange glow. The next day, they returned to the cemetery, hoping to see him again, to ask him about what they'd seen. But when they asked the locals about Jebediah, they were met with confused looks. "Jebediah?" an old man at the diner said, frowning. "We haven't had a caretaker here in years. The last one died decades ago, Jebediah Hawk, if I remember right. Some say he still wanders Boothil, though, keeping watch over the dead." The students left Tombstone with a newfound respect for Boothil graveyard and its ghostly legends. They never spoke of that night again, but each one of them remembered Jebediah's piercing gaze, and the whispering voices of the restless dead. They had gone looking for a thrill, but they had found something else, something that stayed with them, haunting their memories like the ghosts of Boothil. Chapter 2. Boothil graveyard lay under the cover of darkness, its graves a twisted sea of broken headstones and rusted iron crosses. In the desert, nightfall had a way of stretching time, casting shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Boothil, with its history of violence and tragedy, had a reputation as a place where the dead never quite stayed at rest. Travelers and thrill-seekers came, drawn to stories of haunted whispers and eerie apparitions, but very few lingered. It was the start of October when Ethan, a writer of supernatural thrillers, arrived in Tombstone. He had come seeking inspiration for a new book, a tale about restless spirits and the haunted desert. The idea of visiting Boothil graveyard under a full moon seemed like the perfect way to dive into his project. He wasn't much of a believer in ghosts, but the atmosphere of Boothil, with its dark legends and ghost stories, might just be the spark he needed. On his first night in town, Ethan was surprised by how lively the town square was. It was clear that Tombstone leaned into its history, with performers and actors dressed in period garb, recreating scenes from the infamous days of Wyatt Earp and the OK Corral shootout. But his interest lay elsewhere. He wanted to see Boothil at its most desolate, untouched by modern lights and sounds. After asking around, he found that the best time to go was late at night when the tourists were gone, and the only sounds were the whisper of the wind and the distant call of coyotes. That same night, just as the moon rose high, Ethan made his way to Boothil. He carried a flashlight, a notebook, and an old Polaroid camera he'd borrowed from a shop in town. The caretaker had warned him to be careful. "Sometimes, the dead don't take kindly to visitors," the old man had said, his eyes crinkling with an inscrutable expression. Undeterred, Ethan entered the graveyard, walking between the rows of haphazard graves, their names etched in crude stone markers. He passed the grave of Lester Moore, the postal worker who'd been shot over a package dispute, and the graves of Billy Clanton and the McClory brothers, casualties of the bloody OK Corral shootout. The air was still, but it felt charged, as if he'd crossed into another world where time moved differently. Ethan found a stone bench near the back of the cemetery and sat down, opening his notebook. He'd barely scribbled a few lines when a prickling sensation crept over him. He glanced around but saw nothing. Boothil was empty. There was no sound but the faint rustle of desert sage carried on the wind. And yet, he could have sworn he wasn't alone. He raised his camera and snapped a picture of the graves in front of him, half expecting to capture a ghostly form, some proof of the stories he'd heard. The photograph developed slowly, the shadows of the graves emerging in stark black and white. But when the image was fully visible, his heart skipped a beat. There, standing at the edge of the frame, was a figure, a man in a dark coat and wide-brimmed hat, staring straight at him. Ethan looked up, scanning the graveyard, but no one was there. The cemetery was silent, still as a tomb. He shook his head, laughing nervously. It was probably just a trick of the light, or maybe his imagination playing tricks on him. He shoved the Polaroid into his pocket and resumed his writing, trying to ignore the lingering feeling of being watched. Hours passed, and the moon crept across the sky, casting long, finger-like shadows over the graves. Ethan was absorbed in his work, his pen scratching against the paper as he jotted down ideas, descriptions, fragments of dialogue. He was so engrossed that he didn't notice the temperature dropping until a chill settled over him, sharp and biting. He shivered, rubbing his arms, but the cold only grew worse, sinking into his bones. A strange sound broke the silence, a low, murmuring voice, faint and distant, like a whisper carried on the wind. Ethan froze, listening. It was a man's voice, rough and garbled, speaking words he couldn't quite make out. He glanced around, half expecting to see someone nearby, but the graveyard was empty. The voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing off the tombstones. "Who's there?" he called, his voice shaky. The only response was a burst of laughter, cold and hollow, coming from somewhere deep within the graveyard. Heart pounding, Ethan rose to his feet, gripping his flashlight tightly. He shone the beam over the graves, sweeping it back and forth, but there was nothing there. The voice had stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that pressed down on him like a weight. He told himself it was just his imagination, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something that didn't belong to the world of the living. Just as he was about to leave, he caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye. A figure was standing by the grave of Lester Moore, shrouded in shadow, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The figure wore a long coat and a hat, just like the man in the Polaroid. Swallowing hard, he raised his camera and snapped another picture. The flash illuminated the graveyard for a brief second, casting the figure in stark relief. But when the light faded, the figure was gone. He stared at the empty space where it had been, his mind racing. He glanced down at the Polaroid, waiting for the image to develop. When it did, his heart lurched. The figure was there, clear as day, standing by Lester Moore's grave with a grim expression on its face. But this time, there was something different. The figure's eyes, piercing and dark, seemed to stare straight at him, filled with a strange intensity. He couldn't shake the feeling that those eyes were trying to tell him something, something important. A sudden gust of wind swept through the graveyard, rattling the iron crosses and sending a cloud of dust swirling around him. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Ethan stumbled backward, clutching the Polaroid in his hand, his heart pounding. He knew he needed to leave, but his feet felt rooted to the spot. And then, the voice returned, louder and clearer than before. "Why did you come here?" it whispered, each word dripping with menace. I didn't mean to disturb you," Ethan stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to learn about the history, to tell your story." The laughter returned, echoing through the graveyard, cold and mocking. "You want to tell our story, do you?" the voice sneered. "Then stay a while, and listen." Ethan's flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows over the graves. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe, taking on shapes that twisted and contorted, as if they were alive. The figures of long-dead gunfighters, miners, and outlaws appeared before him, their faces twisted with anger and sorrow. They reached out to him, their hands ghostly and translucent, their eyes filled with a hunger that sent a chill down his spine. "Tell our story," they whispered, their voices merging into a low, mournful chorus. "Tell the world what they did to us." Ethan stumbled backward, tripping over a broken headstone and falling to the ground. The ghosts loomed over him, their faces etched with pain and rage. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His heart raced, his mind reeling as the shadows closed in around him, their cold fingers brushing against his skin. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone. The graveyard was silent once more, the shadows still and lifeless. Ethan sat on the ground, his chest heaving, his heart pounding in his ears. He glanced down at the Polaroid in his hand, his fingers trembling. The photograph had changed. The figure was gone, replaced by a message scrawled in dark, jagged letters, "Remember us." Shaken, Ethan stumbled out of the graveyard, his mind reeling. He knew he would never forget what he had seen, the faces of the restless dead burned into his memory. He had come to Boothil seeking a story, but he had found something much darker, a truth that haunted the desert, a secret that refused to be buried. He left Tombstone the next morning, vowing to tell the world the story of Boothil, the story of those who had died violent deaths and were doomed to wander the graveyard, waiting for someone to remember them. And as he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ghostly figure of the man in the wide-brimmed hat standing by the side of the road, watching him go. But there was nothing there, only the empty desert stretching out before him, silent and vast. Story 2. The Watcher at Fort Stevens. Fort Stevens National Cemetery lay just beyond the dunes of Oregon's wild coast, shrouded by fog and shadowed by twisted pines. The cemetery was quiet, the graves hidden by dense mist as if the dead sought to keep their secrets buried. Local legends whispered of eerie happenings, unseen watchers, whispers on the wind, shadows that flickered where no one stood. But nothing captured the locals' imagination more than the tale of the Watcher, a spirit bound by grief, wandering among the graves of fallen soldiers, lonely and restless. Elise was skeptical. A historian by trade, she had studied many cemeteries in her quest to uncover the truth of America's military history, and Fort Stevens was simply next on her list. But Fort Stevens had something the others didn't, the suicide grave. Buried alone in the farthest corner of the cemetery lay the grave of Andrew Blackwell, a soldier from the Civil War era who had died by his own hand. Suicides were once buried on unconsecrated ground, cast apart from their comrades, and rumors swirled that those buried this way were bound to earth as punishment. The cemetery's old caretaker, George, had warned Elise not to get too close to Blackwell's grave. He said strange things happened to those who did, as if the spirit of Andrew Blackwell resented his separation and sought to escape his grave. Ignoring his warnings, Elise set up her camp for the night at the edge of the cemetery. She had come alone, determined to conduct her research without distraction. She set up her equipment, organizing her camera, voice recorder, and notebook in preparation to capture anything unusual. The cemetery stretched out before her, silent and shrouded in mist. Shadows loomed between the gravestones, and the quiet was so thick it felt like a weight pressing down on her. Around midnight, Elise made her way to Blackwell's grave. It was a simple headstone, worn by time and covered in moss. There were no flowers, no signs of recent visitors. She snapped a few photos, her flashlight casting an eerie glow over the stone. As she adjusted her camera, she felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, like someone was watching her. She glanced around, but the cemetery was empty. Shrugging it off, Elise knelt down by the grave, pressing her voice recorder's button. "Andrew Blackwell," she murmured, her voice low, "I'm here to tell your story. I want to know why you linger here." The wind picked up, rustling the trees and sending a chill down her spine. She waited, hoping for a sign, a whisper, anything that might confirm the tales. But there was only silence. As she stood up to leave, she spotted something glinting in the grass beside the grave. Leaning down, she picked it up. It was an old brass button, tarnished but still intact. A shiver ran down her spine. She'd heard that objects sometimes appeared by graves, gifts left by spirits who sought recognition or release. Shrugging, she pocketed the button and began her walk back to camp. But with every step, the silence grew heavier, the darkness deeper, as if the very air had thickened around her. She felt that same prickling sensation, the sense that she was being followed, watched. She glanced back, and her breath caught in her throat. A figure stood by Blackwell's grave, tall and thin, dressed in the tattered uniform of a Civil War soldier. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, staring straight at her. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. She raised her camera, snapping a picture, but the flash only revealed empty space. When she looked again, the figure was gone, leaving her alone in the mist. Back at her tent, Elise checked her camera. The picture was blank, no figure, no shadow, just the empty graveyard. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the encounter as her imagination. But her hands trembled as she placed the brass button on her notebook, staring at it, wondering if she had somehow stirred something she shouldn't have. Unable to sleep, Elise decided to listen to her voice recorder. She pressed play, her pulse quickening as she heard her own voice murmuring by Blackwell's grave. She skipped ahead, hoping to hear something unusual. But as she neared the end of the recording, a faint whisper broke the silence, low and raspy, barely audible. "Why, did you come here?" Her blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakably male, rough and tinged with anger. Heart racing, she replayed the clip, straining to make out the words. But no matter how many times she listened, the words remained the same, filled with accusation and sorrow. Determined to understand, Elise returned to Blackwell's grave the next night. She brought the button with her, wondering if it had somehow triggered the ghost's response. She set the button on the headstone, her hands shaking. "I'm here to understand you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I want to know why you're still here." The wind picked up, colder than before, swirling around her with a strange, unnatural intensity. Shadows flickered between the graves, coalescing into vague shapes, half-seen figures moving through the mist. She watched in horror as one figure after another emerged, soldiers dressed in tattered uniforms, their faces twisted with grief and anger. They stood silently, watching her, their eyes dark and empty. And then she saw him, the Watcher. He stood apart from the others, tall and thin, his face obscured by shadow. His eyes were dark pits, filled with an intensity that made her blood turn to ice. "Why did you take it?" he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Elise took a step back, her heart pounding. I didn't mean to disturb you," she stammered, feeling her courage falter. "I just wanted to understand." "You don't belong here," he interrupted, his voice filled with a sorrow that cut through her like a knife. "None of you do. You took what wasn't yours, and now we are bound to this place, forgotten, forsaken." The other figures moved closer, their faces twisted with despair and anger, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She could feel their pain, their sorrow, pressing down on her like a weight, suffocating her. Desperate to escape, Elise turned and ran, her footsteps echoing through the empty graveyard. She could feel them behind her, their presence pressing in on her like a wave, their voices merging into a low, mournful wail. "Tell our story," they whispered, their voices filled with a terrible longing. "Remember us." She stumbled out of the graveyard, gasping for breath, her mind reeling. She had come seeking a story, but she had found something much darker, a truth that refused to be forgotten, a secret bound to the earth of Fort Stevens, waiting for someone to remember. For the rest of her life, Elise never returned to Fort Stevens. But she kept the button, a reminder of the night she had come face to face with the Watcher, a man who had lost his life and his peace, bound forever to the graveyard he could never leave. And she never forgot his words, the haunting refrain that echoed in her mind. Chapter 2. The Lost Signal. The Fort Stevens National Cemetery sat in mournful solitude along Oregon's rugged coast, a remnant of wartime service that still echoed through the trees. The cemetery was quiet, its history lined in rows of stones, each marking soldiers who had given everything, or had taken something away. One particular grave, set apart at the far edge of the cemetery, bore no flowers, no recent markings. It belonged to Thomas Reed, a radio operator during World War II, who, according to records, had taken his own life in 1945. Few spoke of him, fewer visited, and whispers circulated about strange occurrences around his grave. No one quite understood why Thomas Reed's grave felt different. Freddie was a field technician for a paranormal investigations show and had been researching Fort Stevens for months before they decided to shoot an episode there. Despite his colleagues' skeptical laughs, he believed the stories about Reed's grave and the supposed phenomena surrounding it. After hours of reading local lore, he learned that Reed had been part of the coastal defense during the war, receiving and relaying critical communications. The tragedy of his death was made stranger by rumors of his unsteady mental state during his final weeks, with mentions of disembodied voices heard on his equipment. The eerie last note in his records chilled Freddie. Reed claimed to have received a message from beyond right before his death. Freddie's curiosity was boundless, and he managed to convince the production team to let him spend an extra night at the cemetery before the shoot. He had his own equipment packed, an old radio, a recorder, a few candles, and a makeshift bedroll for the long hours ahead. Dusk fell over the cemetery as he set up his gear, casting the gravestones in somber tones of gray. He made his way to Reed's grave, where the stone bore no epitaph, just the soldier's name, rank, and dates. Freddie adjusted his radio equipment, tuning to low frequencies that typically crackled with static. He settled in for a quiet night, intending to capture what he could and log any unusual signals or sounds. As the hours ticked by, the wind picked up, and mist rolled in, blanketing the headstones in a ghostly fog. His radio whispered in low static, sometimes catching blips or faint hums, but nothing out of the ordinary. Until midnight. At exactly 12 o'clock, the static vanished, replaced by a low hum, rhythmic and pulsing. Freddie's heart raced as he adjusted the dial, trying to locate the source. He strained to listen, pressing his headphones closer. It sounded like a voice, distant and muffled, barely perceptible beneath the hum. Freddie shivered but kept his focus, transcribing the sounds that slowly became words. Cold, dark, lost. The words, raspy and distorted, crackled through the headphones, sending a chill down his spine. He looked around the cemetery, feeling a strange presence, a watchfulness in the mist. Suddenly, the radio crackled, and a new voice emerged, this one firmer, tinged with urgency. They're coming. I can hear them. Freddie's heart pounded as he realized the voice sounded exactly like an old recording from the 1940s, thick, clipped, the cadence of a man trained in military protocol. He checked his equipment, convinced this was some trick of the airwaves. But the voice continued, growing in intensity, laced with fear. They're close. So close, can't stop them. Freddie froze. He knew these words. He had read them in an old transcript, part of Reed's last transmission to the station. According to records, it was the last time anyone heard from Thomas Reed. He leaned in, breathless, unable to tear himself away from the haunting monologue playing through his headphones. The voice grew louder, fractured, desperate. I hear them. They're calling my name. A chill rippled through Freddie, and he stumbled back, yanking the headphones off. His heart raced as he looked around, feeling as if something was watching him from the shadows beyond the grave. In the silence that followed, he was suddenly aware of another sound, a faint, repetitive clicking coming from his recorder, which he had set on the headstone. He pressed play, his fingers shaking. The recording played back the whispers he'd heard, but then something new emerged, a faint Morse code signal, repetitive and eerie. His blood ran cold as he translated it, SOS. A figure emerged in the fog, a shadowy silhouette by Reed's grave. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in an old military uniform, his face obscured by the fog but his outline unervingly clear. Freddie held his breath, frozen in place, feeling as if the ground beneath him had gone ice cold. He wanted to look away, but something about the figure held him captive, compelling him to watch. The figure moved, walking slowly along the row of graves, stopping at Reed's headstone. It seemed to stare directly at Freddy, its dark eyes filled with an intensity that felt almost tangible. Freddy took a step back, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure raised a hand, pointing toward the radio. Its lips moved, whispering words that Freddy couldn't hear. Suddenly, the radio crackled to life, and the voice returned, desperate, pleading. "They're here. I can't escape." Freddy's blood ran cold as the figure stepped closer, its face now visible. It was Reed, or at least, it resembled the photograph Freddy had seen in his research. But the face was twisted, tormented, filled with a sorrow that sent a shiver down his spine. The whispers intensified, filling the air with a low, haunting chant that seemed to echo from every direction. Freddy wanted to scream, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from Reed's tortured face. The figure's whisper reached his ears, barely more than a breath. "They called me, into the dark." Freddy's flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows over the graves. He felt the weight of the dead pressing down on him, their sorrow and pain seeping into his bones. The fog thickened, obscuring his vision, and the whispers grew louder, merging into a mournful chorus that filled his ears, drowning out all other sound. In a final surge of courage, Freddy turned and ran, his footsteps echoing through the silent cemetery. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the cemetery, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of his own frantic breathing. He returned to his hotel, shaken but determined to make sense of what he had experienced. He reviewed the recording, listening to Reed's voice and the chilling Morse code message that had played on his radio. He transcribed every word, every sound, hoping to piece together the mystery that had haunted Fort Stevens for decades. But the more he listened, the more he realized that some questions would never be answered, that some mysteries were meant to remain in the shadows. And as he fell asleep, haunted by Reed's final words, he heard a faint whisper in the darkness, "I can't escape." If you like this scary horror video, subscribe my YouTube channel for more new interesting scary video. Thank you.